This is a coordinated entry training on the HUD Category 4 definition of homelessness. I'm Jason Alexander. I am with Capacity for Change, and I am the Eastern Pennsylvania Continuum of Care Coordinated Entry Consultant. So, as you know, are hopefully aware, we are a continuum of care that serves 33 counties in Eastern Pennsylvania that are connected geographically, but represent very distinct regions and communities. And our coordinated entry system is designed to serve the entire region. And core entry is the process by which anyone who is unhoused and experiencing literal homelessness or at imminent risk of homelessness can access the services and housing that the network of Eastern Pennsylvania CoC providers can deliver. In the Eastern PA CoC, we can anyone can access coordinated entry either by contacting 211, call or text, or by either scheduling an appointment or walking into one of our over 30 coordinated entry access sites. We also have additional access points for DV survivors and people actively fleeing domestic violence and other forms of violence through our network of victim service providers, some of whom participate in the core entry intake and work with our core entry managers to make sure that households they serve are properly enrolled in our system. And the process, again, is identical regardless of whether you contact 211 or core entry access site. This is the front door into services that include street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and homelessness prevention services. HUD funded or federally funded programs must accept their referrals or enrollments through core entry, and we encourage our other community providers to do the same so that there is a uniform coordinated entry experience for all residents throughout the 33 county region. Core entry is not and cannot guarantee that housing and services will be provided, but it is the best way for people to get access to the right housing and services. We're going to be talking today about a category 4 and what that means. That's a HUD definition around households that are fleeing or survivors of domestic and other forms of violence. We're going to present those HUD definitions, talk through them, and also highlight some of the key policies and procedures that we have in the Eastern PA CoC to make that process safer and more trauma-informed for survivors. The workflow, there's two workflows when someone is receiving a core entry intake, depending on whether they meet the HUD category definition 1 or 4 of literal homelessness and or fleeing violence, or they are at imminent risk of homelessness and are seeking connection to prevention services, including, for example, rental assistance. We're primarily focused today on households that are category 1 and or 4. So we've had previous trainings on category 1 and 2. HUD category 4 definition of homelessness is as follows. An individual or family who is experiencing trauma or a lack of safety related to or fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other dangerous, traumatic, or life-threatening conditions related to the violence against the individual or a family member in the individual or family's current housing situation, including where the health and safety of children are jeopardized. There's a lot of information there. That's a fairly recently updated and expanded definition. We're going to be talking about the Violence Against Women Act 2022 and the HUD changes to policy and procedure based on that revision to the VAWA Act. We're gonna talk through all these terms that are in the first part of the sentence, and our goal is that core entry specialists throughout the Eastern PA CoC really have a deep understanding of who is eligible for category 4. That's part 1 of a 3-part definition. So the individual or family experiencing that trauma or lack of safety must also have no other safe residence. And that's what our role is, would be to help connect households to a new safe residence and lack the resources to obtain other safe permanent housing. The HUD definition, because again, we are primarily funded by HUD, and actually the continuum of care is a legal entity structured by HUD as and we have to comply with these definitions. That doesn't mean our entire network and our partners in the victim service provider community have to align identically with this Category 4 definition. But for you as our core entry specialists, we really have to follow this definition when we are identifying the pathway that we will take people through in their core entry intake, assessment, and referral process. HUD Category 4 definition is also inclusive of households fleeing human trafficking. So this is a continuation of the definition of Category 4, and specifically, this is a Category 4 for any individual or family who is fleeing or attempting to flee human trafficking. HUD considers human trafficking, including sex trafficking, to be part of the previous definition of other dangerous or life-threatening conditions that relate to violence against the individual or family member. So we'll talk more about what the federal definition of human trafficking is as we move through this presentation. I did reference the Violence Against Women Act, and it has a significant set of implications for many systems of care, including our homeless crisis response continuum of care. And so if you're not familiar with VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act is a federal law that in part provides housing protections for people applying for or living in units subsidized by the federal government, in our case, primarily HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and who have experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking to help keep them safe and reduce their likelihood of experiencing homelessness. At the very end of this presentation and slide deck, there are links to other resources. There is a dedicated and fairly new section of the HUD.gov website that's dedicated to VAWA and the HUD policies and procedures that come out of alignment with this act. Many of them pertain to housing programs beyond court entry, but just to highlight a few of the key things that are related to it, there are VAWA housing protections related to court entry. So I would encourage housing providers in the Eastern PA CoC to go to the HUD.gov/VAWA website to understand more of the housing protections related to programs like rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. But this is really just some highlights related to court entry. So under VAWA, someone who has experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and or stalking cannot be denied admission to or assistance under a HUD subsidized or assisted program because of the violence or abuse committed against them. So we're always going to be providing access to HUD-funded housing and services in the Eastern PA CoC to anyone who has experienced these conditions. And you may be talking to people that have been threatened with eviction. People cannot be evicted from a HUD-subsidized unit nor have their assistance terminated because of violence or abuse committed against them, and again are eligible for referral to our housing and services. They can request an emergency transfer if they are in a federally subsidized or HUD subsidized unit and there are safety reasons related to violence or abuse committed against them after they've been enrolled and moved into a CoC funded project. We have an entire emergency transfer plan for this purpose that is also linked at the end of this presentation. And I will talk later about how core entry is involved in those emergency transfer plans. But for core entry specialists, please be aware that you personally are not involved in implementing an emergency transfer plan, but our 5 dedicated core entry regional managers are responsible and have a role in that as necessary. People have a right to strict confidentiality of information regarding their status as a survivor. We have some significant protocols and procedures in place that I will be talking about later and that you all as specialists are familiar with to protect that confidentiality of personally identifying information. And finally, have the right to seek law enforcement or emergency assistance for themselves or others without being penalized by local laws or policies for these requests or because they were victims of criminal activity. So the practical implication being people contacting Court Entry, um, we're gonna talk about how we do safety planning and offer the option to be transferred to an appropriate hotline, whether it's domestic violence or human trafficking. But there should never be a feeling that someone contacting Court Entry is any threat of being connected with law enforcement or emergency assistance against their will, or that there'll be any sort of reporting done without their permission or will. There won't be anything done. Court Entry, our purpose is to identify survivors and connect them safely with appropriate services, and that is what HUD expects us to do related to the VAWA Act. I want to get into the definitions of that HUD definition category 4, because when our Court Entry specialists are working with people in crisis, they're describing their unique situation, and then it's our specialist responsibility to interpret that in a way that fits with and aligns with our HUD category definitions. So I want to take a few slides here to really break down these terms in more detail. And these are all defined or codified either in federal law and or HUD policy. And so first, the term domestic violence, again, these are official federal definitions utilized by HUD and our Court Entry system. The term domestic violence includes felony or misdemeanor crimes committed by a current or former spouse or intimate partner of the victim under the family or domestic violence laws of Pennsylvania, receiving grant funding, and in the case of victim services, includes the use of or attempted use of physical abuse or sexual abuse, a pattern of any other coercive behavior committed, enabled, or solicited to gain or maintain power and control over a victim, including verbal, psychological, economic, or technological abuse that may or may not constitute criminal behavior. So let me pause. This definition was expanded by HUD in 2023 as a result of the implementation of the VAWA Act of 2022. So the concepts, for example, of economic or technological abuse are new to the HUD VAWA definitions, and I'll be unpacking those in more detail. But that may be what you're hearing about. And we're not asking, as a reminder, we're not asking people to provide their details. They may share them with you, but self-identifying as fleeing or a survivor of any of these forms of domestic violence or other forms of violence and trafficking is all Court Entry requires to begin an intake that leads to a referral or set of referrals and by nameless placement for people that are fleeing or survivors. So we're never asking for these details, but they may be shared. And if they are shared, they can be helpful in just helping us understand, yes, this household would meet that category 4 criteria. So the definition of domestic violence picks up with, again, abuse that may or may not constitute criminal behavior by a person who is a current or former spouse or intimate partner of the victim or person similarly situated to a spouse of the victim, is cohabitating or has cohabitated with the victim as a spouse or intimate partner, shares a child in common with the victim, or commits acts against a youth or adult victim who is protected from those acts under family or domestic violence laws. So it's a much more expansive, inclusive, comprehensive definition, and it just really empowers Court Entry specialists to identify people that meet this eligibility, this definition more succinctly. I mentioned what is new is one term is economic abuse. What that means is in the context of domestic violence and other forms of violence, behavior that is coercive, deceptive, or unreasonably controls or restrains a person's ability to acquire, use, or maintain economic resources to which they are entitled, including using coercion, fraud, or manipulation to restrict a person's access to money, assets, credit, or financial information, unfairly use a person's personal economic resources, including money, assets, and credit for one's own advantage, or exerting undue influence over a person's financial and economic behavior or decisions, including forcing default on joint or other financial obligations, exploiting powers of attorney, guardianship, or conservatorship, or failing or neglecting to act in the best interest of a person to whom one has a fiduciary duty. And the companion new term, technological abuse, means an act or pattern of behavior that occurs within domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, or stalking, and is intended to harm, threaten, intimidate, control, stalk, harass, impersonate, exploit, extort, or monitor, except as otherwise permitted by law, another person that occurs using any form of technology, including but not limited to internet-enabled devices, online spaces and platforms, computers, mobile devices, cameras, and imaging programs, apps, location tracking devices, or communication technologies, or any other emerging technologies. So again, a very expansive and inclusive addition to the HUD Category 4 definition. The other terms that are part of the definition of Category 4, dating violence. What does that mean? That's violence committed by a person who is or has been in a social relationship of a romantic or intimate nature with the victim, and where the existence of such a relationship shall be determined based on a consideration of factors including length of the relationship, type of the relationship, frequency of interaction between the persons involved in the relationship. It's important for us to understand these terms and definitions. We are not asking any intrusive or probing questions for details related to these definitions in order to do an intake for someone Cat 4, just for our deeper understanding. Other terms in the definition: sexual assault is any non-consensual sexual act prescribed by federal, tribal, or state law, including when the victim lacks capacity to consent. Stalking means engaging in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. And there is a federal definition of human trafficking. It takes two forms. Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. And the other form of human trafficking, forced labor, is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. All of these are included in the Category 4 definition and allow households to be eligible for a Cat 1, Cat 4 intake, assessment, referral, and by nameless placement. So in complying with these HUD federal definitions of Category 4, as they've been expanded by the VAWA Act of 2022, we have a number of local Eastern PA CoC core entry policies and procedures specific to Cat 4. These are just highlights to make everyone aware, but there are much more detailed policies and procedures related to Cat 4 within both our Eastern PA CoC written standards manual as well as our core entry policies and procedures. And there are links to both of those documents at the end of this presentation. But to highlight 4 key elements that we as a CoC have integrated into our core entry system. 1, we have a set of safety planning questions. These are two major questions related to fleeing spousal or intimate partner violence and or fleeing or surviving the other forms of violence and human trafficking that are part of the Category 4 definition. We ask those questions before an intake in our PA-HMIS data system begins, because if necessary and if the person we're talking to, the head of household, wants we will connect them directly to a local DV hotline or the National Domestic Violence Hotline, or if they're fleeing trafficking, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And we also have, of course, our network of victim service providers, including domestic violence and human trafficking providers, that can also be part of this process. But if you are presenting at court entry and are fleeing or a survivor, you will have the opportunity to self-identify. If you'd like to be transferred immediately to a hotline, we will do so. And otherwise, we will begin the court entry intake process. As I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation, we do have partnerships with some of our victim service providers that where court entry intake can be done by a case manager or a staff member at a VSP. That information will not all be entered into our HMIS data system, but relevant information, particularly related to the assessment, will be entered into the system by one of our court entry regional managers with protocols in place to protect the personally identifying information of those survivors. And to that end, when people are contacting court entry directly and want intake and have self disclosed or identified as fleeing or a survivor, we do offer them the option of a completely DV anonymous intake, which means that all of their personally identifying information is automatically left out of HMIS and out of the intake. The relevant pieces of information are stored outside of HMIS in another secure data system for the purpose of making sure that we can connect those survivors to our housing and service case managers so they can be assisted. Then we have significant number of people that choose for that anonymous option, but also a significant number that don't. And we still have a protocol in place to track and make sure that we are serving DV survivors that have enrolled in court entry without the anonymous protocol, meaning they have chosen or elected to have their personal information in their HMIS client record, but we still have indicators that they are fleeing or surviving DV. And finally, I referenced our emergency transfer plan. That's when any member of a household who is a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and or human trafficking, and reason believes there's a threat of imminent harm from further violence if they remain in a unit that we've helped place them in, there is a protocol for them to be able to transfer to another safe residence. And as additional protection for victims of sexual assault, the program participant may also be eligible to transfer if the assault occurred on premises within the 90-day calendar period preceding the request for a transfer. So again, that's a really important plan we have in place. Our court entry specialists do not have to be involved in that, but our court entry regional managers are part of that process as necessary to help make sure that survivors are transferred to another safe residence. So this is just really an overview of Category 4, how it relates to our court entry system, but there is so much more to know. And so some resources linked on this page will take you directly to resources that reference more specifically how we work with people that are fleeing and survivors, what the policies and procedures are around that, what some of the more detailed federal guidance is. So if you're interested, particularly, I recommend the HUD Violence Against Women Act resources page, which again is fairly new, has so much information. And also the Eastern PA CoC has ongoing trainings, many of which are provided by PCADV, that really help us understand how do you work with survivors in a trauma-informed way. So that conversation is outside the scope of this presentation, but there are other resources available to court entry specialists in the Eastern PA CoC to help make sure they are working with survivors in a way that ensures safety, ensures confidentiality, and ensures that they are going to have access to all of the housing and resources that are necessary to end their experience of homelessness.